Okay, I'd like to welcome you all for coming today. My name is Lou Petch. I'm on the biology faculty here at UW-Marathon County and chair of the Program Planning Committee for the Wisconsin Institute of Public Policy and Service. And the Institute, or what we call WIPS, has the goal of providing programming for things like public scholarships, civil dialogue, civic engagement, and collaboration between universities and the communities that we serve. WIPS is in its second year, and UW-Marathon County is in its third year of having shared campus community shared readings and programming. And this year's theme is Wealth and Poverty in America. And our goal with this programming is to address some of the issues associated with the increasing disparities of wealth and opportunity in the United States today. On deck in the next few days, there's a couple other events associated with wealth and poverty. One will be tomorrow at 9:30 in the Terrace Room, and tonight's panelist, Michael Zweig, will present a program on the topic of class in America for Continuing Education Soapbox Series. And then on Monday, November 17th at 7:30 at the Holton Town Hall, there will be a National Issues Forum public dialogue on crime and punishment. The Institute has been very grateful to receive a lot of support from various donors and foundations and individuals, and we'd like to thank them. These include the Alexander Foundation, the B.A. and Esther Greenheck Foundation, the Kettering Foundation, the National Issues Forum, the Community Foundation of North Central Wisconsin, the UW-Marathon County Foundation, Hermanning Financial Group, Marathon County, Wisconsin Humanities Council, the UW Colleges and Extension, the Office of the Chancellor of the UW Colleges and Extension, National Endowment for the Humanities, Nancy Frawley, Clay Norbaum, and Rose Marie and Warren Stevens. The Program Planning Committee has a subcommittee that has organized and worked very hard on the programming for this year. And that subcommittee includes Ann Herter-Rapp, John Houchins, Vicki Richmond Hawkins, and Judy Witkoff. A lot of work to put this stuff together has been done by our WIPS program associate Gene Greenwood, and we're very lucky to have three very hardworking interns, Logan Middleton, Joshua Knight, and Hope Cameron. After the panel discussion is done, there will be a question and answers period, and our interns will be going around with a microphone, and we'll ask that you please speak into the microphone when you ask your question, because things are being recorded tonight for broadcast on public access television. When we are done tonight, there will be a reception in the Terrace Room, which if you go out the door here and turn to the right, you can see the Terrace Room, and you can meet with the panelists and have some refreshments. Tonight's program is called The Class War, Labor, Social Mobility, and Wealth in America. And I'll hand it over now to Jim Lawrence, Professor Emeritus of History at UWMC, who will be the moderator for this evening.
Thank you, Lou, and welcome, everybody. Our featured speaker this evening is Professor Michael Zweig, who is Professor of Economics at the State University of New York in Stony Brook, where he is also director of the Center for the Study of Working Class Life. He completed his PhD at the University of Michigan, has published widely in his field of working class studies, including, first of all, the Working Class Majority, America's Best Kept Secret, Cornell University Press, and more recently, this very interesting book that I had a look at before this evening called What's Class Got to Do with It? Also Cornell University Press. His topic this evening is going to be what class got to do with it, and we hope to find out. He will be exploring for us conceptions of class in American society. Our second presenter, panelist, is Professor, at his left, Professor Shelton Stromquist, who's Professor of History at the University of Iowa. Professor Stromquist completed his PhD at the University of Pittsburgh. He is a specialist in United States labor history and social history, and has focused on a variety of projects that examine the meaning and historical significance of class in American life. He's also, if I'm not mistaken, a former board member of the Wisconsin Labor History Society, which is a very important organization in our state that tries to promote the study of history in our schools and an understanding of labor history in our state. Professor Stromquist has compiled a distinguished publication record over the years, including one of my favorites, The Generation of Boomers, the pattern of railroad conflict in 19th century America, with the University of Illinois Press. And more recently, and very relevant to our subject this evening, another very interesting book, Reinventing the People. The Progressive Movement, the Class Problem, and the Origins of Modern Liberalism, also at the University of Illinois Press. His topic this evening, I love his title, is Class Dismissed, 20th Century Liberals' Evasion of the Class Problem. And Shell will be exploring the historical context for the class divide in America, including the reluctance of American liberals to see the world in class terms. And finally, our third panelist is Professor David Newby, who is the president of the Wisconsin AFL-CIO. Under David's leadership. Well, he was a professor too. We'll get around to that. Under his leadership, the state AFL-CIO has become a leader nationwide in the area of political action, economic development, legislative initiatives on behalf of working families, and more generally, strong representation of the interests of working people everywhere. As I was about to say, he's also a closet historian and teacher. He doesn't always talk about that, I guess. I don't know. He did teach for some time, as a matter of fact. He has degrees from the College of Worcester and the University of Chicago, and completed his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Following that, he taught history at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. And as an individual citizen, he was then and has been ever since, I think, active in the area of civil rights and other social movements beginning in the 1960s. He also was as I recall, a key figure in the establishment of the Wisconsin Labor History Society, and I think, and continues to serve as a board member of that organization. And his topic will be the role of the modern labor movement in addressing class inequalities in the United States. He'll help us, I think, to explore some approaches to the economic and social problems faced today in these unsettled times. So let us begin then with an exploration of the definition of class in American society and the ways in which these conceptions have shaped the structure of wealth and poverty in the modern United States. Please help me welcome Professor Michael Zweig.
Thank you very much, Jim and Jean and everybody else here. And I appreciate everybody coming out for this event on a snowy night. I don't think it's possible to begin any public forum or private discussion this week without really reflecting for a moment on the significance and the great historical moment that we've had as a country in the election of Barack Obama to be President of the United States. I think that it is really a momentous occasion, and it is a qualitative, I believe, a qualitative transformation of the American political and social life. Not to say that this is a post-racial society or that we're done with racism, but as Obama liked to quote Dr. King, whose picture is in the hallway over here, I did notice, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards freedom. There's a couple of salient points in that. It's long. If you think for a moment that it's been 40 years, 43 years since the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and that was 100 years after the end of slavery, the arc of history is long. And if you think about the women's movement, and you think that between Seneca Falls in 1848 and the passage of the amendment to the Constitution that allowed women to vote in 1920, it's 72 years. It's a long time. You think on the workers' agenda about the 8-hour day, going back from Haymarket in 1886 till the passage of the the FMLA, Fair Labor Standards Act. If you think about that, in 1938, that's, was that 54 years? It's a long time. The arc of history is long, but it does bend towards freedom. And I think we need to understand that we are just coming out of a period of American history that is truly shameful, I believe. And we will, you know, no one looks back at the McCarthy period. I know I'm in Wisconsin, and I know that Senator McCarthy was elected by the good people of this state. But I do believe that very few people look back and say, you know what we need? We need Joe McCarthy back. You know what we need? We need Cotton Mather. Where is Cotton Mather when we need him? People don't look back at those periods. Oh, let's have Hitler. People don't look back at those periods and say, oh, now there was an idea that really didn't get tested enough. People look back at those periods of retrogression. People look back at those periods where the baser human instincts are drawn on by demagogic politicians as moments of shame. And I think that that means that this arc of history, which bends towards freedom and is long, there's nothing uniform about that bending. There's a process which has its ups and downs, its backs and forth. But I do think that with this election of Senator Obama, we have come to a qualitative moment where we can say that that arc of freedom has been, finally, towards freedom. Now, I think that having a black president, you know, we've had black people in positions of real serious authority in the United States for a while now. This isn't the first time. Of course, the presidency is the pinnacle of political power in the United States, but you know, we have a black man who's on the United States Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas. Now, Clarence Thomas is not my favorite political or social beacon, but if you're 7 years old, it doesn't matter. If you're 7 years old and you see a picture of who's on the United States Supreme Court, and there's a black guy there, that says black people can be on the United States Supreme Court. And that's a very powerful thing. It's only when you get to be 17 that it starts to dawn on you that, well, who is this guy and what does he really stand for? Now, we just had Hillary Clinton presenting a very credible run for President of the United States, and we got told that Sarah Palin was the apotheosis of the women's movement, come to rescue the Republican Party and sweep the women's vote into the White House. Well, you know, we can chuckle, as people are in the audience here, and it's just ludicrous and preposterous, but what does it tell us? It tells us women need to be in positions of authority, and we've come to a place in this country where women can be in those positions, although we still haven't quite tested whether a woman can really be elected. We haven't quite tested the depths or the limits of male chauvinism in this country. But we have come to a place where we can say, which woman? We won't be satisfied just to have a woman, just as we won't be satisfied just to have a black guy. Which? And the fact that we have come as a country to a place where we can begin to really ask that question in a serious way, that we have accepted as a people, as a society, that we can put black people into the White House, we can put women into the White House, it brings us straight face to face with the question, which one? And that is a class question. Which black guy? Which woman? Well, that depends upon what they stand for. That depends upon what agenda they promote. And that agenda, that choice, I would propose now that confronts our country is essentially a class question. And we see it presented in very, very stark ways in the economic crisis that we are in the midst of, where working people are suffering all across the country, and in two wars which working people are fighting. It's working class young men and women who are in Afghanistan. It's working class young men and women who are in Pakistan and in Iraq. The crisis of war, the crisis of economic arrangements, the crisis of finance is fundamentally a crisis of working class America. And the ability of our country to address those crises, I believe, is going to take a long time to mature. But the arc of history is long, but it does tend towards freedom. Not spontaneously, not all by itself. People have to get out there and pull that arc of history. You know, you know how you get an email message sometimes at the bottom, there's this little saying that the person has, and they put a little thing, whatever it might be. And I'm thinking that I want to maybe put at the bottom of mine, bend that arc. You know, just get out there and bend that arc towards freedom, towards justice. And I believe that that is an agenda of working class power, as much as the agenda of civil rights and the agenda of women's rights were agendas of a particular constituency, a particular section of the population, but a section in a constituency that represented freedom, justice, and the best aspirations of America as a country. The fact that this country has come to a place where we can do what we did last week, to me says that it's one amazing country. The American people are a fine and important contribution to the political arena in the world. I do believe that. Now, Bill Ayers was a friend of mine. I still know him. I'm still in communication with him. I was involved in organizing SDS in those days, and I was never a weatherman. I never agreed with it, and we had many discussions at that time. And to me, the core difference that I felt with that tendency in 1968, in 1969, was that what I sensed was a fundamental disrespect for the American people, a fundamental holding that the American people were pigs. I never could accept that. As difficult as the American people can be, as difficult as the tasks are in front of us, I think that we have to understand that the American people are capable of making a glorious history. We've done it before, we will continue to do it. Now the question is class. Not to say that race and gender are finished, or that we've solved those problems, but the problems of race and gender can no longer be presented to us simply as, let's get a black guy in the White House. Let's get a black guy in the United States Supreme Court. Let's get a woman to be commander-in-chief. We are now at a place where those questions of race and gender need to be rolled into a class analysis and a class dynamic of American society. So let me say a word about what I think I mean by class. I think class is best understood as a question of power rather than income or lifestyle or wealth. Now, obviously, income and wealth and lifestyles are markers of class, imperfect and incomplete and often misleading. I think it's important for us to recognize that class is fundamentally a question of power, just as race and gender are questions of power. And I think that if we talk about class in America, as I did in that book, The Working Class Majority, America's Best Kept Secret, I looked into class as occupation, as a proxy for power. Those people who are in jobs that don't have a lot of authority or control over their work, those are working class people. Now, that's not just blue-collar workers, that's also white-collar workers, bank clerks, and call center workers, and home health care workers, and cashiers, and all kinds of people who are in the service trades, in the service industries, as well, of course, as construction workers and industrial workers who haven't totally disappeared in this country. When I added up all the occupations and the numbers of people in those occupations, it's 62% of the labor force of the United States. This is not a middle-class country. This is a working-class society. This is a society in which the working class are overwhelmingly the majority. Now, you might not think that people would understand that so easily because, after all, everybody's middle class, as we know from the politicians who are all after middle-class tax cuts, and we're all for the middle class, and we're going to do this for the middle class and that for the middle class. But if you ask people, what class are you? And you say upper class, middle class, or lower class, most people will say middle class. But if you put working class into the mix, half the population will say, yeah, that's me. So we can talk about the working class as a class. And I've just heard here that at this school, in some sociology classes, the students are asked at the beginning of the semester, what class are you in? There's no list. There's just an open-ended question. Half the class says that they're in the working class, or they come out of working class families. So I think that we can safely talk about the working class without fear that we're going to be put off into a corner somewhere as strangers from another century. So, because class is a question of power, power is a relationship. You can't have power unless someone else has not power. Or you can't have little power unless someone else has more power over your job, over the technology that's going to be implemented, over the marketing strategy, or whatever it turns out to be. So the polarity, I think, that we have to deal with in the class structure of American society is the working class on the one hand and the capitalist class on the other hand. Now, I know that there are difficulties in talking about the capitalist class, but I have to say that if Malcolm Forbes can have on Forbes magazine Capitalist Tool, I don't see why we can't talk about the capitalist class. There is a capitalist class in this country. There are the captains of industry, the boards of directors, the CEOs, the people who are really giving strategic guidance to the economic institutions, the major economic institutions of the country. And that's about 2% of the labor force. So we have a working class of 62%, a capitalist class of 2%, and a middle class, 36%, which is in the middle of those two major polar classes. This middle class of professionals, of managers and supervisors, and of small business owners. That middle class is in the middle of this power grid of labor and capital. That middle class has certain characteristics and certain aspirations that are like capitalists, in the belief in private property, in the belief in individual initiative, in the belief in the importance of individual autonomy, and in a certain hostility often towards unions. On the other hand, that same middle class has certain characteristics and attitudes and orientation that's connected to the working class. They have often a hard time getting health insurance. They are also working under more or less close supervision of somebody above them. They don't have full authority. They have difficulty getting credit if they're a small business compared with the larger corporate world. And they feel themselves often squeezed in the middle of the power of capital on the one hand constraining what they do, and the power of labor on the other hand making demands on them. Now, if you look over the last 35 or 40 years at the development of American society, everybody knows that there is a great increase in inequality. And you might say, well, that's just the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. Well, yes, the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer, but I would want to suggest to you that that's not the best way to think about it. A more appropriate way to think about it is not that the rich are getting richer, but that the capitalists are getting more power. And in that 35 years, the working class is getting less autonomy, less authority, less power, and so it's the working class that's taking it in the neck while the capitalist class is going to the bank. That's a different thing from saying the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Perhaps later in the question period we can elaborate on some of these ideas, but right now I just want to lay out the main points and the main themes. So we have a working class which is in fairly great distress. I just finished a study through the Center for Study of Working Class Life at Stony Brook, which we call Economic Stimulus and Economically Distressed Workers. This was a program that was designed to come up with a stimulus package that was directed at low-wage labor, at low-wage workers. And it was requested by some congressmen on Long Island. We did the study over the summer. We delivered it in September. But one point I wanted to make here, for our purposes, is that we started out calling this a study of low-wage labor. And in addition to going through the data from the Census Bureau, we also went out to low-wage workers, and we talked to them, brought together by the Long Island Federation of Labor, the AFL-CIO on Long Island, Jobs with Justice, and the local immigrant rights organization, the Workplace Project. And it didn't take long into those discussions when we figured out that maybe low-wage worker isn't the best way to characterize this population. Because who wants to be low-wage? Who wants to be the working poor? Once you formulate and describe a population in a way that repels them, you can't engage in intellectual work that draws them into a social movement, because the very terms that you use are repellent. So we changed the way we talked about it, and we gave up the formulation of the working poor or the low-wage population, and in the course of these discussions understood that the key element to capture was the distress, the economic distress that these families and these workers were experiencing. Distress over paying their rent, distress over losing their homes, distress over not having health insurance, distress over not having unemployment compensation, distress that they can't educate their kids, distress, distress, distress. And we found that that distress is far beyond the official poverty rate. The level of economic discomfort and distress and hardship in this country is double, and in some places triple, the official poverty rate. So when we talk about a crisis now in this country of working people, it's a very profound and far-flung experience. And that experience is not only in the immediate economic crisis of home foreclosures and unemployment and lost jobs, but it is also experienced in the war and in the international arena. This financial crisis that is gripping Wall Street is gripping the entire capitalist world, which is to say the entire world. This financial crisis is global. And I come from Detroit, and I know about the Rust Belt, and I know what happens when cities and major industrial cities collapse. It's a very, not only is it an ugly thing, it's a profoundly sad thing. When I go back to Detroit, it's just sad. to see the ruin of a city that was one of the great cities of America when I was growing up. But that crisis is enmeshed in a global economic system. Now, sometimes we talk about the United States as a superpower, the world's only superpower. And it is. But I think that that's a mistaken formulation. The reason is because it, A, focuses overwhelmingly on the military aspect of power, and B, it doesn't tell us who the power is for. It just says America is a powerful country. I think it's much more appropriate to think of the United States as the world's first truly global capitalist empire, or seeking to be the world's first truly global capitalist empire, meeting resistance from around the world, in the developed world and developing world. It's a complicated story, but it is a story of international capitalist development that we in this country are enmeshed in. Now here, let me just throw in one piece of orientation. Sometimes we think of globalization as over there. We have a domestic economy, and then there's the global economy. And if only we could protect ourselves here in America, we could somehow or other insulate ourselves from the global economy. I think that that is not a helpful formulation. It's one economy. Wisconsin is part of the global economy. Alabama is part of the global economy, and so is Suffolk County, New York, where Stony Brook University is. It is one capitalist enterprise worldwide, and it faces a worldwide crisis. And that crisis is represented now most boldly in this financial meltdown that's sweeping the planet. So this brings me back to this question of the immediate question in front of us in this country is a class question. The question of economic crisis and the question of war. Both of those things are crises of capitalist empire. And I think that understanding that as a capitalist empire, where the class dimension is the working class, the capitalist class as the main polarity, and a middle class caught in between, is a helpful way, I would propose, to understand the dynamic that we're now involved in. One observation about this middle class. If you look over the last 30 or 35 years, those elements of the middle class, whether we're talking about managers and professionals, managers and supervisors, whether we're talking about professionals like lawyers, doctors, accountants, or if we're talking about small businesses, those elements of the middle class who are most closely associated in their work and in their livelihood with the capitalist class have done very well. Those elements of the middle class that are most closely associated in their livelihood and in their work with the working class have suffered greatly. That means doctors who are on Park Avenue, New York, who don't take insurance because their clients can just come in and their patients and write a check, they're doing very well until about 3 weeks ago. The doctor who's working in a clinic, depending on Medicaid payments, that's a professional person, that's a middle-class person, that's a person who's suffering right now. A lawyer who hangs out a shingle in a small community that's just doing general law and divorce law and property law right in a small town community, that lawyer's having a hard time. A lawyer who's working in a Wall Street law firm, that's a lawyer, but connected with a different class in that polarity, that part of the middle class is doing rather well. So when we try to understand this polarity, I think we need to understand that I'm speaking now for myself as an academic, as a middle-class person, we need to understand the forces that are gripping public education and public higher education and destroying both public education in K through 12 and public higher education throughout the country. The forces that are doing that are the forces of capital seeking to privatize and to destroy the public sector. And labor and working people are served by that sector, and those of us who work in the public sector, our job is to serve that public. And because capital has no respect or interest in that public, we are caught in a crossfire. That means that we need to think about, in this middle class, politically, in this arc that's bending towards freedom, who's going to be bending which way? That's a political question. That's a question that all of us have to now begin to confront. While we understand that race and gender are not finished, this class question needs to be more salient. Now, the challenge to neoliberalism and the challenge to the war on terror, the very conception of an idea of a war on terror, I think we have to really challenge. There is an organization within the labor movement that does that. That's U.S. Labor Against the War. And for those who don't know about it, I would recommend you check it out, uslaboragainstwar.org. I have materials here anybody can take a look at. It's an attempt on the part of the American working class, the American labor movement, to enter into the international arena, international solidarity with the Iraqi workers, to have a peaceful resolution of this problem and remove American troops from that country and allow for a vibrant and protected working class movement, labor movement in Iraq to grow, to have authority, and to have power. Most people sitting in this room don't know that there's a labor movement in Iraq, but there is one. Most people in this room understand very well that the U.S. blew up every institution in Iraq, all of Saddam Hussein's regime. There was one law that the U.S. authorities kept into force. That was Law 150 from 1987, in which Saddam Hussein declared that public sector unions in Iraq were illegal. That law we kept on the books. That law, of course, maybe we shouldn't be surprised since public sector unions are also illegal in North Carolina. Public sector unions are also illegal in Missouri and in a lot of other places. So once again, we see that there is a parallel between the experience of working people in the United States and the experience of people internationally. So if I say now the problem is in front of us is the class problem, we have to ask, where's the labor movement in that process? And here I will end with a couple of observations. Labor movement in the United States is severely weakened. The numbers of people who are in the labor movement now covered by collective bargaining is about 12% in the country. In the private sector, it's less than 7%, compared with 35 to 40% in the 1950s. So the labor movement in the United States is greatly weakened. There is a need to reconstruct a broad social movement of working people. Not just going shop by shop and organizing in this industry or that plant, but a social movement of the working class that can vie for power in this country. The way there was a social movement of women, a social movement of African Americans, a social movement of Chicanos. Where is the social movement of working people? We need to create that. Now, here I want to just observe and reflect on the fact that this is a global economic system. And it just may be that the upsurge of working class resistance and working class challenge to the power of empire and to the power of capital will not originate in the United States. It may originate in Brazil. It may originate in Indonesia. It may originate in Mozambique. We need to, in this country, in our labor movement, in our popular movements, in our academic work, in our intellectual work, be open to those movements of working people all around the globe, in India, in China, in Bolivia, where people are challenging not the rich, they're challenging capital. They're beginning now to, with us in this country, come to the point where the real issue in front of us is the issue of class and the issue of the working class challenging for power on a strategic plane in the organization of society, representing the whole of society, representing that arc of freedom that is long but bends towards freedom, that arc of history which we are now setting out into a new phase, not to turn our back on the questions of race, not to turn our back on the questions of gender, but to integrate those questions of race and gender into the class divisions, into the class conflict, which is the motor of the next period, which I think perhaps will take yet another 50, 70, 80 years. But as the Chinese like to say, march of 10,000 miles begins with a single step. So let's get out there and bend that arc. And I'll leave you with that.
Good evening. It's great to be back in Wisconsin and to join this illustrious panel. It's especially nice to see old friends David Newby and Jim Lawrence. I used to live and work in Wisconsin at one point for the State Historical Society and occasionally made my way through Wausau and these parts, visiting with people who were doing local history. So it's a lot of fun to be back. I'm the historian, right? And so, not surprisingly, this is going to be a talk about class in a historical context. Like Michael Zweig, I want to focus on the peculiarities of class divisions in American society. But in particular, I want to look at the roots of our collective myopia about class. That is, our inability or unwillingness to recognize the deep and abiding class divisions that have marked our society historically. And this is particularly true, I think, in the 20th century. Pardon me if I stick close to my text. If I don't, I'm afraid I'll keep you here all evening. Let me begin with a brief comment, like Michael, about the significance of this last week that we've just been through, and also then a story from the progressive era. I actually had a conversation with a New York Times reporter before the election, who was writing a prospective article assuming the election of Barack Obama. And she wanted to think about, or wanted to think with me about, what a new progressive era might look like in America if Barack Obama were elected. And I tried to convey to her that my sense, at least, is that there's a lot more ambiguity about progressivism than we sometimes assume. But to talk for a moment about the election, we all remember, how can we forget, Joe the plumber. His 15 minutes of fame, all right, maybe it was more than 15 minutes, derived from that chance encounter with Barack Obama on a rope line after his speech in Ohio. Joe asked Barack, if I'm remembering this correctly, whether he would raise his taxes. And Barack answered that if his income were below $250,000 a year, his taxes would actually go down under Obama's plan. There was some back and forth, and the conversation concluded with Barack saying something to the effect that those at the top of the income ladder had a responsibility to help those at the bottom, a sort of fundamental principle embedded in our progressive tax structure, or supposedly progressive tax structure. But amidst all the hype and the misrepresentation that followed, one theme surfaced persistently from that conversation, and particularly as it was interpreted by the Republicans. Barack Obama, according to John McCain and Sarah Palin, had revealed himself to be a redistributionist. I thought that was a marvelous term. Or even an advocate of socialism. During the third and final debate, McCain turned to Obama at one point and accused him of preaching class war when he dared to suggest that persons with high incomes should rightly pay higher taxes than those with lower incomes. This is hardly, we could talk about Joe the Plumber if we want to. I'm not sure we want to, but Joe is actually kind of an interesting embodiment of the sort of paradoxes and confusion about class in America. And it would be an interesting exercise to unpack that a little bit, but I'll save that for the discussion if we go there. This is hardly a new ploy for liberals to face, but that is that they're accused of preaching class war. But it is an accusation that many seem incapable of adequately defending against. Barack Obama, from my reading of the whole exchange and the subsequent discussions, showed some backbone in not backing away from his position. But like liberals and progressives over the course of the 20th century, Barack and his allies have also, it seems to me, lost the ability to talk with any clarity about class, the threat of the class power wielded by elites, and the need to mobilize workers and the poor to mount a direct challenge to the power. And I liked Michael Zweig's formulation of class as power, to mount a direct challenge to the ruling elite's power. If real change, that is, change we can believe in, is to happen, it seems to me clearly that has to be part of it. Instead, liberals resort to a classless rhetoric that speaks of a seemingly all-embracing middle class. Why is it so difficult for politicians to use the phrase working class? Apparently from Michael's surveys, people themselves, at least that 62%, don't have much trouble calling themselves or seeing themselves as working class. But liberals appeal to unity as Americans, undifferentiated by class interests, to the expansion of opportunity for all, but we fail to ask the question, when and how did we lose that ability to talk explicitly and openly about class? It is the root of this loss of class that I wish to focus on tonight, and the bankruptcy of 20th century liberalism and its antecedents, going as far back as the Progressive Era, which is the period that I, as a historian, happen to focus on, and the book that I just did focuses on. So let me go back to that period and give you a story about someone I'm sure you know, Jane Addams, the founder of Hull House in Chicago in 1889, and perhaps the most famous social reformer of her generation. She had, I would argue, a class problem. She'd grown up in a middle-class Quaker household in Cedarville, Illinois, not far from the Wisconsin border, and through a variety of experiences, both in the US and in Europe, had been deeply moved by the plight of the poor. These experiences led directly to her founding, along with some other colleagues, Hull House in Chicago, an experiment in social service that enabled mostly young women of privileged backgrounds to live and work among the immigrant poor in Chicago's near West Side. But Addams, like many of her generation, was also witness to the deepening class conflict that tore the social fabric of American society in the late 19th century. She'd grown up amidst it, and that challenged the privileges, that is, that class conflict did, of the Gilded Age upper class, whose ostentatious consumption and unbridled power accentuated the sense of a deep and unbridgeable class divide. The language of class war had a palpably immediate relevance in the wake of the railroad strikes of 1877, the rise of the Knights of Labor, the Haymarket bombing in 1886, and its aftermath, and a rising crescendo of strikes and a powerful producerist movement in the late 1880s and early 90s. People talked about class. Class was on everyone's lips. It was the social problem. All this was, however, quite disquieting for someone like Addams, despite her good intentions. In 1890, not long after establishing herself in Chicago, she wrote, "We are not willing, openly and professedly, to assume that American citizens are broken up into classes, even if we make that assumption the preface to a plea that the superior class has duties to the inferior." So she's actually couching an argument against seeing the world in class terms in class terms. It's an interesting and somewhat contradictory formulation that suggests her own developing sort of consciousness about this. But just a few years later, in the early summer of 1894, with the outbreak of the Pullman car shop workers' strike, Adams faced a formidable challenge. She felt torn between sympathy for the strikers and her own desire to bridge the class divisions that the strike revealed. She was frustrated that the arbitration efforts that were undertaken had not borne fruit. As the only member of a self-appointed arbitration committee to have met and actually talked with the striking Pullman workers and listened to their grievances, she had also dutifully sat in on meetings with the officers and managers of the Pullman Corporation who repeatedly insisted there was absolutely nothing to arbitrate. With that pronouncement, the arbitration effort effectively collapsed, and to her dismay, class war once again loomed on the horizon in the form of the most massive strike of the era, the Pullman boycott, that effectively shut down the Western railroads for nearly a month. As the bitter strike and boycott of the nation's railroads unfolded, resulting in scores of strikers' deaths and hundreds wounded, Adams vividly remembered a pilgrimage she took in the midst of the strike to the newly erected statue of Abraham Lincoln near the lakefront in Chicago. In her autobiography, she writes, "I walked the wearisome way from Hull House to Lincoln Park, for no cars were running regularly at that moment of sympathetic strikes, in order to look at and gain magnanimous counsel, if I might, from the marvelous St. Gaudens's statue. Some of Lincoln's immortal words were cut into the stone at his feet, and never did a distracted town more sorely need the healing of with charity towards all than did Chicago at that moment, and the tolerance of the man who had won charity for those on both sides of the irrepressible conflict." Like her fellow reformers, Adams had come of age in an era of profound labor conflict. Solving the class problem, as she saw it and her colleagues saw it, became the preoccupation of their generation. The progressive movement, then, I would argue, banished the language of class from the vocabulary of reform. By focusing on the individual, by attacking the environment that limited individual opportunity, progressives promoted the idea that social differences based on entrenched inequality could be ameliorated through voluntary action and very limited government intervention. In their view, neither individuals acting collectively nor the government through class legislation, which was a bad word, should attempt to alter the fundamental structures of social power and property. That was a given for them. They assumed that stayed in place. By seeking to reinvent a society in which class had no enduring place, progressives lay the foundation for 20th century liberals' inability to see the world around them in class terms, or to conceive of social remedies that altered the social structures of class power. Progressives did not invent the idea of social harmony or class harmony. The elimination of property qualifications for white male voters had made citizenship technically classless, while still excluding, of course, African Americans, non-naturalized immigrants, and women. After the Civil War, a liberal free labor ideology promised universal access to opportunity through the capitalist marketplace and a bountiful frontier. But as the Industrial Revolution advanced in the late 19th century and class conflict erupted on an unprecedented scale, a working class critique of this acquisitive individualism gained wide support within a self-styled class of producers. If day-to-day poverty, long working hours, and economic oppression might effectively deny the rights of citizenship to a large portion of the population, and if the resulting wage slavery, which was a term that was widely used in the 19th century, placed them in a position analogous to chattel slaves, then the universalizing claims of Republican citizenship lost its meaning. Progressive reformers at the turn of the century undertook the project of reclaiming citizens from the human junk, that was their term, produced by industrialization. Unlike the more radical producerist movement of the 1880s and 90s, They saw harm, not virtue, in a dispossessed class empowered to reclaim the wealth it created and to realign the structures of power that produced inequality. The reformers embraced the idea that industrial progress, organized by capitalist property holders, would produce prosperity and alleviate misery. Economist Simon Patton's optimism about the liberating effects of increased consumption through economic growth inspired a whole generation of reformers. For journalist Walter Whale, a Patton student, this vision lessened the prospect of class war. Quote, "Where wealth is growing at a rapid rate, the multitude may be fed without breaking in to the rich man's granary." That prescription has remained at the heart of liberal progressive thought throughout the 20th century. Edward Devine and the editors of Charities in the Commons argued that the problem to be solved was a set of more or less isolated, conquerable evils, not a bad system. Reformers might mount an attack on unsanitary tenements or tuberculosis and child labor, as if it were worthwhile to overcome them, even while the private property and wages and profits remain in evidence as essential features of the industrial system. That's his language. In 1908, Chicago reformer Graham Taylor worried that some signs pointed to an awakening of the wage earners of our country to the consciousness of their class interests. That was a problem. But progressive reformers found themselves continually challenged by a popular insurgency outside the movement itself. That conflict periodically broke the surface of reform and produced a sense of crisis, precipitating political and social realignment that reshaped the terrain on which the reform community worked. Whether in the form of massive streetcar strikes in Cleveland or Philadelphia, third-party insurgencies erupting in San Francisco or Oklahoma, yes, Oklahoma, all-out class war in the coal fields of Colorado or West Virginia, or a mind-numbing tragedy like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, the orderliness and efficiency of managed reform and the sense of a moral whole shattered periodically, and alternative pathways to reform appeared. Counterposed then to that core movement of progressive reform was a more radical, if episodic, movement determined to realign the fundamental ways the power of labor and realign in fundamental ways the power of labor and capital. Those radicals revealed their alternative reform vision in an aggressive working class movement in the Colorado and Rocky Mountain West, in a new urban politics that battled for municipal ownership, and among increasingly vocal groups of labor progressives who stood outside of the narrow trade unionism of the AFL in that period, and the professional proponents of labor arbitration. Even before the European war reared its head, the project of harmonizing class relations and extending democratic citizenship by reforming the worst consequences of capitalist industrialization had foundered on the shoals of renewed class warfare. Progressives divided over how to meet this challenge. Could American society permanently transcend divisive class warfare? Could the ideal of a classless people be sustained in the face of ongoing crises of an industrial society? Did growth of a new immigrant working class, the reproduction of inequality and the social divisions based on race and ethnicity threaten the integrity of the people, the civic community that they imagined? The persistence of class conflict then in America challenged the defining feature of the progressive movement, its promise of social harmony through democratic renewal. The New Republic poignantly articulated that dilemma and the reformers' impotence. This is the New Republic of the teens. Quote, "Between organized labor on the one hand and organized capital on the other, the large class which lives by rendering services to both," this is very much consistent with Michael's conception of where the middle class lies in this, the large class which lives by rendering services to both stands an excellent chance of being crushed as between the upper and nether The project of solving the class problem did not expire with the era of World War I. And I'm skipping here because I want to keep an eye on the time. A coalition of reformers, some trade unionists, Taylor Society, that is Frederick Winslow Taylor, the proponent of scientific management, his adherents, and enlightened employers sought to invest harmony of interests with new meaning during the 1920s, and in doing so, established a framework for industrial relations that prefigured the CIO and government-regulated collective bargaining as the path to industrial peace. The New Deal persuaded hard-pressed and politically mobilized workers and farmers to look to Washington and FDR's Democratic Party in their quest for security. But the Depression was not without its disquieting moments for the New Dealers, the heirs of this progressive tradition, when class war seemed again on the agenda. Labor's achievement of the right to bargain collectively in a framework defined by the Wagner Act nevertheless seemed to promise the long-deferred resolution of the class problem. As one historian has perceptively noted, the New Deal produced a double transformation: the ascendance of labor and the eclipse of the labor question. New Deal liberalism, like its progressive antecedents and its later 20th century liberal incarnations, was hardly monolithic. While rejecting the class perspective associated with 19th century producerism and the class agenda of radical industrial Democrats, New Deal liberals and their Great Society heirs adopted the progressives' core values and their project of using the state in limited ways to engineer a society more inclusive of the people and less vulnerable to the social upheavals the dispossessed themselves might provoke. To the extent that they succeeded, liberal reformers persuaded Americans that despite persistent evidence of class divisions, the unfinished project of reinventing the people, enlarging the domain of opportunity, and fostering social harmony might still keep at bay the ravages of class war. That prospect had seemed a real danger for the first generation of progressive reformers, as it had during the turbulent years of the Great Depression. If the class problem moved perceptibly to the margins during the later stages of the New Deal and more decidedly after World War II, liberal reformers simultaneously developed a new preoccupation with racial and ethnic discrimination. This was not a wholly new concern, but the rise of Nazism gave new urgency to the meaning of racial and ethnic differences in a democratic society, and to the cultural and political changes needed to foster toleration and accommodate difference. For many liberal reformers, what had been social facts of secondary interest, this was certainly true for the progressives, who didn't really think much about the race problem unless pushed by W.E.B. Du Bois to do so. For many liberal reformers, what had been social facts of secondary interest moved to the center. This reconfiguring of liberalism also reinforced the displacement of the class problem, tainted as it now was in the McCarthy era by the association with communism. Social change in its racial dimension would dominate the post-war liberal reform agenda, setting the stage for a new wave of social legislation in the 1960s that addressed primarily civic and social, not economic rights. The Great Society programs nevertheless reflected to some degree the dual traditions within liberalism. Through, on the one hand, a war on poverty that kind of in a muted way did address issues of class, and a campaign to extend civil rights based on race and ethnic discrimination that essentially focused on civic and social rights. But an explicit vocabulary of class receded even deeper into the lexicon of liberal reform. Late 20th century liberals, in many ways, fulfilled the destiny that progressive reformers had defined for them in the century's early years. If the class problem had been solved, it had not been solved, it had at least been redefined in ways that made it seem antiquated and irrelevant by the century's end. The problems of racial assimilation and identity, augmented by new rights consciousness, challenging discrimination against racial minorities, women, gays, and lesbians, dominated liberal reform discourse and the quest for democratic community. Clinton-era liberals were deeply shocked then to be accused by their right-wing opponents of preaching class war when they discussed tax inequities or sought to craft ameliorative legislation that addressed the health care needs of middle-class Americans. Indeed, the political vocabulary of class, to the extent that it remained, conjured up an all-embracing middle class that had become the surrogate for the progressives' old idea of the people. Ironically, then, it was right-wing activists, not liberals, who re-injected an older idea of class into the language of politics and put it to novel and polarizing purposes of their own in the 1990s and beyond. Liberals stood about somewhat dazed and confused as they were accused of promoting class war, uncertain whether they too must now abandon the idea of class reconciliation for a new politics of class. John McCain and Sarah Palin's accusation that Barack Obama and the Democrats are redistributionists or even socialists, bent on taking from one class and giving it to another, is only the latest incarnation of this political rhetoric. Having successfully disarmed labor progressives early in the century and jettisoned the language of class from their reform arsenal, liberals late in the century stood accused of promoting the very class perspective against which they had so persistently fought. However, reinventing class as a vehicle for a new reform politics seemed beyond their imagination. That imaginative and practical challenge is one that remains for us to take on. Whether the newly empowered liberal Democrats, including Barack Obama, will be prepared for that challenge remains to be seen. But if they seriously pursue policies that contribute, among other things, to building a rejuvenated labor movement, that will be an important signal that they have recognized the realities of class in America and the necessity to contest the entrenched power of corporate elites, something 20th century progressives and liberals have rarely done. Thank you.
Guess I better set this down here. Otherwise, we're going to have a real mess on our hands. Excuse me. I have been asked to address the question on the role of the modern labor movement in addressing class inequalities in the United States. And I must say that if I were to rewrite the topic of these remarks, it would be the potential of the labor movement to address these inequalities. Because the fact of the matter is that the labor movement, the contemporary labor movement, essentially since the Second World War, has failed to recognize class and even to use the term working class. We're much more likely to use the terms either working families or very often middle class, and to fall into the same trap that both Michael and Shel have been talking about, of not understanding the role of class within our society. Because not recognizing the power structure, not recognizing the role and definition of class, really does confuse our understanding of the power structure in this country. I would certainly agree with both Michael and with Shel that class is not a matter simply of income, it's a question of power. But the power of the capitalist class includes the power to appropriate wealth. And so that makes it so easy for us to get confused about the difference between the capitalist class, which really controls the society, controls the economy, and those who simply have enormous wealth. And indeed, especially for the past 35 years, due in part to the decline in the power of the labor movement itself as being able to contest the power of the capitalist class, we have seen an almost unbridled campaign by the capitalist class to appropriate unimaginable wealth for itself. And I do have a very short PowerPoint presentation which I'd like to flip through very quickly here, just to give you some idea, and I think you're familiar with a lot of these developments, but just to sort of remind ourselves of what has happened since particularly the early 1970s in terms of the redistribution of wealth and power in this country. When we look at the average increase in workers' income since actually the end of the Second World War, we see that in the first period from 1947 to 73, that there has been essentially a redistribution of wealth towards those at the bottom of the income standard. That the poorest 20%, for example, improved their worker income by about 116%, and the richest only 84.6. So that's a good thing, that all of the new wealth that was being created after the Second World War was being distributed in a progressive manner. Now, when we look at the period from 1973 to 2004, all of a sudden that's reversed. And the poorest 20% gets only a 2.8% increase, while the richest gets 63.6%. That's the richest 20%. Now, that would be bad enough, but if we look at, for example, the top 1/10%, then their wealth increased by $1.7 million a year, or 181%. And if we look at the very richest, the 1/100% of the richest people in this country, we find that they're basically off the charts with an increase in wealth of 497%, compared to poor folks down here, the poorest 20%, having an increase of only 2.8%. So an incredible shifting point in the early 1970s in terms of the distribution of wealth and the appropriation of wealth within this country. Now, we see also that this coincides with a very interesting change in the relationship between productivity and wages. Productivity meaning basically how much wealth can one person produce in 1 hour's work. And we find that, once again, from the end of the Second World War until the early 1970s, that the increases in productivity were pretty much matched by increases in workers' wages. So in other words, the increased wealth that workers produced was shared in a consistent fashion with those who were actually producing that wealth. But look what happens after 1973, very consistent with this same redistribution of wealth. And that is that productivity continues to increase at about the same pace, in fact, a little bit faster, and yet wages are basically flat and have been flat since the early 1970s. I think we all know what has happened to CEO pay. This only goes up to 2004. There's been various fluctuations. But once again, we see that, that workers' wages, while remaining flat, that here again, in the late 60s, early 70s, there's all of a sudden this takeoff of pay and income for those at the top of the corporate structure. Now, every once in a while, we have somebody at the top of the, or close to the top of the capitalist class actually telling us in words we can understand what's really happening. And Stanley Mihalik, who was the executive vice president of Goodyear, was quoted in the New York Times in 1987 of saying that until we get wage levels down much closer to those of the Brazils and Koreas, we cannot pass along productivity gains to workers' wages and still be competitive. Now that, of course, is exactly what we saw in the graph of what has happened with the relationship between productivity and wages. And this, without going into it a great deal here, also fits into the new agenda in terms of globalization and changing the rules of international trade. We also know that we have an increasingly substandard minimum wage. And that should be a matter of concern to us because the minimum wage is the absolute floor of what anybody can be paid. And yet we find today that even with some recent increases in the minimum wage is not a living wage. You simply can't live on the bottom wage that you can be paid. Now, the average wage, and these are 2005 statistics, the average wage in 2005 was $18.62. When the minimum wage was first introduced by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s, it was set at 50% of the average wage. And so if that were still the case today, then our minimum wage would be $9.31. Back in 2005, it was actually just a little bit more than half of that, $5.15. It's over $6 now, but still not a whole lot of change when you adjust that for inflation. Small government has been the mantra of the right wing and the capitalist class, and yet it's interesting that we, in the process of downsizing government and downsizing services to the citizenry itself, that the share of the cost of that paid by corporations has continued to fall and still is continuing to fall. I mentioned globalization before, and I think we're all familiar with the effects of the international trade treaties that we have entered into, from NAFTA, CAFTA, the World Trade Organization, and so forth, but perhaps not realizing just the incredible impact. And we've seen this in Wisconsin in terms of the shrinking of our manufacturing base. But the case of the Sunbeam Corporation that makes the Mr. Coffee machines is very instructive, I think, because Sunbeam bought Mr. Coffee in 1996. At that time, the coffee makers were made by union workers in the United States. Their wage averaged about $21 an hour. Sunbeam decided within 2 years that they were paying too much for people to make coffee makers, and so they moved the whole operation to Mexico. And there they paid the workers $2.36. Obviously impossible for American workers being paid $21 an hour to compete with workers paid $2.36 an hour using probably the same machinery as it was being used here in the United States. But it took them only 3 more years to decide that, geez, they were paying the workers far too much to make coffee makers. And so they moved the whole operation from high-wage Mexico to lower-wage China, where they paid the workers an average of 47 cents an hour. That has been the restructuring of our international economy in the interest of the capitalist class, which has gained all of the benefits of this kind of wage drop and wage competition. And ordinary workers, as we have seen flat wages and no improvement in their standard of living at all. The thing to keep in mind, I think, in terms of the potential of the American labor movement to change the power structure within this country is that despite the fact that we are a lesser percentage of the workforce than we have been since the 1920s, the actual number of union members, there may be another slide on this, but there may be, the actual number of union members has stayed pretty much constant at about 15.5 million workers. The problem is that the size of the workforce has increased, and we simply have not grown with that increase in the workforce, and so the percentage of workers who are union becomes smaller and smaller. And yet, because of the power of organization, union workers, when compared with non-union workers doing the same work, still come out better. And for example, when you look at the percentages that have life insurance to their work, union workers are far more likely to have it. Same thing for health insurance, same thing for disability insurance, and same thing for a defined benefit pension plan. In all cases, these numbers are at risk, and they have been going down in recent years, but basically this is a difference between what a union worker is able to get for their labor as compared to a non-union worker. Here's the actual union membership that I was talking about before. We have a very serious problem in terms of the future of the labor movement. When you look at simply the density, in other words, the percentage of workers that are union, and this is going to lead me into our immediate agenda in the labor movement itself. But if you look at the percentage of workers that were union in 1964, I think you can all see the color coding, the red states. Over 31% of the workers were organized. The dark yellow states between 21 and 30% and so forth. And then you go 20 years later to 1984. What's happened? No more red states. Now, depending on your politics, you might say, oh, that's a good thing. Not good for this graph, not good for union workers. A dramatic decline in terms of the percentage of workers that are union. You look at 2004, and we've almost eliminated the dark yellow states, and in most states we have less than 20 or even less than 10% of the workers organized. And then we look to the future. What happens if we don't change things? Well, the projected union density in 2024 would make us look like this, so that almost even the light yellow states, those with less than 10% union membership, are eliminated. If that happens, then we are no longer going to have a labor movement that can get for its own members better working conditions and better benefits, but also to be able to have the impact within our society to be able to change things for the better for working people and the working class as a whole. Ooh, boy, did that go fast. Well, you know, that's all right. Why don't we just end it there? The point is that we can change it, and let's end with that slide, because that is the obvious agenda for the labor movement today, is to change those trajectories, to change the direction of each of those figures that we have seen. Now, our task is certainly then to understand power, understand the class structure if we're going to change it. And we are beginning, I think, to understand that structure. And that's reflected in the fact that for the first time in this election cycle, the AFL-CIO not only put a great deal of effort and resources into the electoral and the political process itself, but actually had our own agenda, which we were following at the same time. And there were three main elements to that agenda of what we wanted to achieve by electing working class friendly politicians to office, getting the presidency, getting someone into the presidency that was favorable to unions and to workers, and also making sure that we had majorities in both the Senate and the House that were similarly inclined. Now, our first agenda item is one which you may have heard of. It's not, it is more narrow in terms of the labor movement itself, but it's passage of what is called the Employee Free Choice Act. The Employee Free Choice Act is the first major change in American labor law since Taft-Hartley Act in 1947. As you may know, the United States has the weakest system of labor law in the entire Western world when you look at the rights that workers have and how they are protected within our legal system. And the reality is, and it's been this way for 20 or 30 years, that it's become almost impossible to organize workers in the private sector because of the lack of any kind of penalties against employers for breaking the law and for essentially, in reality, denying workers the rights to choose to have a union. The reason for that is that the way our system is set up is that at least 30% of the workers in a unit have to petition to have an election. And that election then will be held and supervised by the National Labor Relations Board, usually within about 2 months, maybe 3 or 4 months. During that 2 to 4 months, management obviously has an enormous amount of time to talk to workers about why they should not join a union and why they should not vote for the union. And almost every firm will, number one, hire an expert consulting firm that specializes in defeating union organizing drives. They will hold captive audience meetings in which all the workers have to attend, and they are shown films about how bad unions are and how, once again, they should not bring a union into that workplace. Supervisors are taught on how to talk to workers one-on-one about why they shouldn't have a union at their place of work. Usually in the industrial sector, management will say, well, if you decide to unionize, then we're going to have to close up shop and move to Mexico, move to China, and so forth. In 1/4, 25% of all the private sector organizing drives, at least one person who has been active in the organizing drive is illegally fired. Very, very powerful message to the workers in that particular facility. You support the union, this could happen to you as well. And what happens to that worker who's fired? Well, it takes anywhere from 2 to 4 years before there's a final decision as to whether management, oops, oh, that's what happened, I hit this. If there's somebody in the booth, you can just turn that off. There we go. Okay, thanks. 2 to 4 years before there's a decision as to whether management has actually broken the law. And of course, by that time, the original organizing drive has usually collapsed under the threat of intimidation. And the penalty to the company, if they are found guilty, is that they have to post a written notice saying that they did wrong, they broke the law, and they have to give to the person who was fired an amount equal to the difference between what they would have earned if they had kept on working at that firm and what they actually earned in that same period. And obviously, if you're fired, you go out and you try to find another job. So all they have to do is pay the differential and to make the person whole as to what they would have gotten in wages. It's hardly even a slap on the wrist in terms of any kind of penalty, and therefore very tempting even for corporations that would seemingly have some kind of ethics. So the Employee Free Choice Act says, look, we have to return the process of workers having the right to decide whether or not they want a union, to give that process back to the workers, and to not give management the kind of advantages that they currently have to smash organizing drives. And so the Employee Free Choice Act says that instead of having this long period before the election when management can intimidate workers, that workers can circulate authorization cards, and if 50% plus one of the workers in that firm say, yes, we want to have a union, then you give those cards to the National Labor Relations Board, they validate the cards, and a union is certified. Now, the Employee Free Choice Act also deals with another problem, and that is that even today, when we're able to organize a new firm, we only get a first contract in about half of the situations where we organize. And that's because management keeps up its opposition to the union, drags out the bargaining process, refuses to bargain in good faith, and is able to drag that process on so long that workers lose interest in the union and it gradually just fades away. So the Employee Free Choice Act would instead say that once a union is certified, that if there is no contract agreed upon within 60 days, then there is compulsory mediation and, if necessary, the arbitration of a first contract. So workers who decide to organize at least have the guarantee that they're going to get a first contract and have a fair shot at being able to maintain their union. So that's our first priority, and I think you can see why. Because if we can get this act passed, then we at least have a chance at much increased union organizing within the United States. And the more workers, obviously, that we can get into unions, then the more power that the working class as a whole will have. It's not going to happen automatically. We have to make it happen ourselves. But at least it gives us a shot of doing that and giving, once again, power not only to those who belong to unions, but those who don't belong to the unions, but whose interests are the same as those who belong to unions, and through organization have greater power and greater influence within the society. The second major priority for us, and we began a campaign on this issue well over a year ago, and I was fortunate enough to be named to the National Executive Council committee that planned this campaign. But our second objective for this new administration is universal health care. I think we all understand the need for universal health care. Our current health care system is in a shambles. It's unsustainable. We simply can't maintain it. It doesn't work. It costs us twice as much per person as the system for health care in any other country in the entire world, and yet our population does not live as long and we're not as healthy as people in other countries. Something is awfully wrong with the way we have organized our healthcare system. We've got to change it. We can change it. And so universal health care is the second, not necessarily in order, but that's certainly our second objective. The last objective, I won't go into a great deal of detail, but you can sort of sum it up under the term of economic security. And that means, once again, restoring fair wages to workers so that they share more in the wealth that they create, that we have a much more secure system, much more secure economy, so that people have the assurance that when they retire, they're going to have adequate retirement income instead of a constantly shrinking 401k, and that we are going to, at the same time, change the rules of international trade so that international trade and globalization is not stopped and not rolled back, but rather the rules are changed so that it's not simply the capitalist class that benefits from the way we have restructured international trade, but that workers in the United States and the workers in our trading partners reap the advantages of expanded international trade, so that we get this system back the way it ought to be. Well, I guess it never was, I'm not sure. But the point is that globalization does not have to do what happened to the workers at Mr. Coffee. It can be a system in which everybody, the working people who create the wealth in this country and this world, actually gain from globalization and increased trade. We can do that, but to do it, we have to change the rules. Thanks very much.
We have allowed some time here for questions. So if there are questions from the audience, please raise your hand. And I think someone, yes, we have two students with microphones. Please use the microphones. Right here. Yes.
Mr. Newby, with that proposal, is there a champion or champions or administration that is backing this? The Democratic Congress, for instance, are they backing your ideas on these labor proposals?
As far as the Employee Free Choice Act is concerned, is that the one you were thinking of particularly? Yeah. Actually, the Employee Free Choice Act was voted on in the last Congress. It got a majority in the House, it got a majority in the Senate, but there were not 60 votes to stop a filibuster, and President Bush stated that if it did get to his desk, that he would veto that bill. But it already had, in the last Congress, it already had majority support, and we're hoping. Well, first of all, we don't know exactly how many Republicans and Democrats we're going to have in the Senate, but we are hopeful that we will be close enough to that magic number of 60 that, given this, the potential support of moderate Republicans, that we can overcome a filibuster and actually get that to the president's desk. Maybe three, that's right. And by the way, Barack Obama is a co-sponsor of that bill and has said that he's a strong supporter and has said, obviously that he will sign it if it gets to his desk.
Other questions?
Can I just add one
Sorry,
point?
go ahead, Sean. Yes.
When David was showing the slides on union density, I was hoping he would also put up a slide that showed the right-to-work states, because there's a pretty high correlation, obviously, between levels of union density and right-to-work, or inverse correlation. But in any case, state-level legislation, campaigns at the state level to get rid of those right-to-work laws, and Iowa is one of them, is absolutely critical to this process too, because we got free riders who are even in that minority of firms that are unionized, that are benefiting from the struggles that unionized workers have undertaken, and we need to ensure that everybody pays their way, and that unions have the benefit of being able to not to face the uphill battle that they do where state law permits workers to get the benefits of the union without doing anything for it.
I see a question in the back of the room.
Hi, there were two interesting articles in the New York Times. One on Saturday, the front page of the business section, it said, "A nation waiting for another FDR." And then on Sunday in the Week in Review, there was one that talked about how parties were shaped by movements. The Democratic Party shaped by populism of the 1890s, the anti-business reformism of the New Deal, 1930s, and then the 60s civil rights movement was something that they mentioned. I feel like we're ripe for change, and change has been all the rhetoric in this country right now, and it'd take Barack Obama needs to be FDR, but it was really a feisty labor movement that created that. And we can't have the chicken until we have the egg, of this labor movement. FDR would have not have been FDR were it not for this boom in labor activity, were it not for a much more aggressive labor movement that took over the Twin Cities, for instance, or led massive strikes, or walked out of coal mines. We aren't seeing that kind of activity right now because of desperation, because of intimidation, economic desperation, intimidation in the workplace, and just a lack of class consciousness. Where is that going to come from?
You're right. And it's also true, I think, that we are simply not going to see the kind of resurgence in the labor movement or any other popular movement such as we saw either in the 30s or the civil rights movement. However, looking simply at the labor movement itself, I think we've learned a lot, and we know at least the minimum that has to be done. And we had the most extensive and I think smart political campaign running this year than we've ever had before, in terms of the number of volunteers that were working on our campaign, which was totally separate from the candidates. It was strictly a matter of talking to our own members. And that has been the dominant pattern for, excuse me, for how we do politics increasingly over the last 6 to 8 years. That instead of simply urging people to vote for a particular candidate, of giving them the information about the issues and where candidates stand on the issues and how those issues affect them as working people and as working families. So that's one part of it. The other is that there is a recognition that we cannot simply elect politicians who are presumably favorable towards working class interests and then hope they do the right thing. That we do have to be organizing, and in order to be pushing them in order for that agenda to move forward. Excuse me. As a result, the Executive Council of the AFL-CIO has a meeting coming up on Thursday in order to begin to, or continue to plan the campaign for passing those 3 priorities that I talked about at the end of my remarks. First time that's happened after a national election. They have also directed every state federation to hold a statewide leadership meeting in late November, early December, in order to plan our statewide campaigns around those issues. Is that going to be enough? I don't know, but I think it's at least a significant recognition that, once again, you can't just elect people and then let them go and not watch them. You got to both hold them accountable, and you also have to organize the power behind them to push them. I think we also have to recognize that despite all of the incredible enthusiasm and encouraging enthusiasm for Barack Obama and his candidacy, he has never referred to himself as a progressive. He's taken a number of progressive positions. But basically, he's a centrist. And so what our job becomes, no matter, what organizations we're a part of or whether we're not affiliated at all, but somehow we've got to move the center in this country to the left. And if we do that, then we can achieve that agenda.
Can I come in on this a little bit?
Yes, Michael?
Dan Clausen is a sociologist at University of Massachusetts in Amherst. He wrote a book a few years ago called The Next Upsurge, in which he discusses the way in which social movements, as you say, shape the politics of a moment, even of an era. And he notices that in the labor movement in particular, there isn't just a steady step-by-step accretion of power, but these things come in waves. They come in surges or upsurges. So you talk about the 1930s and the great strikes here in the Twin Cities or on the West Coast and the docks and up and down the East Coast. The thing is, we don't know when that next upsurge is going to come. We just don't know. But Dan and another sociologist, Alden Morris, wrote a very interesting article on the lessons of the civil rights movement for the labor movement. And in that article, Clausen and Morris argue that if you look at the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, it was not championed by and organized and mobilized by the existing stable institutions of civil rights, like the NAACP or the National Urban League. That upsurge came from new forms of organization, SCLC, SNCC, and other institutions that didn't exist in the early 1950s or the middle 1950s, but came to exist and came to embody this upsurge that no one had anticipated and no one could have predicted, but yet actually happened. And Alden Morris and Dan Clausen argue that something like that is probably going to happen in the labor movement as well. This next upsurge is almost certainly not going to come from the existing leadership of the AFL-CIO. It's going to come from the bottom. It's going to come from someplace, and then the AFL-CIO and Change to Win are going to be in a position of playing catch-up. Now, in my remarks, I pointed out that we're dealing in a global situation now, and that some of that hope for an upsurge that can challenge the capital that needs to be challenged, that can build that movement, may arise in other countries. And it is important for the labor movement in the United States to be ready to express solidarity and to learn from those struggles and bring those struggles here. And there I think that the role of the immigrant labor and the role of these worker centers and the role of these other community centers of workers that are not unions, they don't undertake collective bargaining, but they do represent the potential for a very powerful upsurge of working class politics in this country, which might then draw the AFL-CIO and the Change to Win and other organized forms in its wake into a progressive politics. But we don't know if that's going to happen. We don't know how long it will take. We don't know what form it will take. And I think we just have to pursue those things and open up and the lines of international solidarity, open up the lines of class consciousness, class awareness, and to work within the AFL-CIO, which I do in my own union, which is at AFT, and through the New York State Fed and through U.S. Labor Against the War and other forms of labor organization to extend and to broaden the scope of vision of the existing labor movement so that it can take on these larger agendas and think strategically, not just about their own particular members or their own interests as an organized labor movement, but as something much broader.
I think there's a question down front.
For Michael Zweig, you were involved in the publishing of a paper, Economic Stimulus and Economically distressed workers.
That's right.
And in that, you propose a plan for an economic stimulus. I'm curious what the status of that plan is. Did it go to the government, either Bush's crew or Obama's? Can
Well,
you brief
thanks.
us on that?
Yeah, thanks for asking. That plan came out, and it was what I was mentioning in my remarks about the going from talking about low-wage workers to these economically distressed workers. And that plan did get some publicity in the Bill Moyers and in Democracy Now! And some other places, including Wisconsin Public Radio. I think I did a long session on the Wisconsin Public Radio in September for almost an hour. But it has gone to the staff in the Joint Economic Committee. It has gone to the staff in Senator Schumer's office from New York, Congressman Israel, who is on the House Appropriations Committee, Congressman Bishop, who is my congressman from the East End of Long Island, who is on the House Committee on Education and the Workforce, which obviously is connected to these labor questions. So it's sort of around and about. Now, whether anybody pays attention to it, you know, I don't have any control over that. I don't know. We'll see. It is out and about, and I am prepared to go talk about it, and I am talking about it in different venues. And I certainly hope that whatever the stimulus package that is constructed, which obviously something is going to happen, that it will be larger than what they're talking about, and that it will be focused on the needs of working people and these economically distressed workers in a way that perhaps the original from earlier this year was certainly not.
Michael, if I could say, I think you're being a bit too modest, because many, if not most, of the elements of what you have proposed have almost become orthodoxy in terms of what is necessary in a stimulus package. It's certainly the core of what the AFL-CIO position is on a major stimulus package, and it is what you know, most, at least progressive Democrats, are talking about. Hopefully to happen in the lame duck session, and that we won't have to wait until a new administration.
Well, anything I could do to help in that process, let me know.
Is there another question? Yes.
I have a question, please. In 2006, Hammer Blow Corporation closed in Wausau. In 2007, we've lost Fiskars, SNE, Stora Enso, Domtar, Herd Corporation, to an effect of about 2,000 jobs. That's over $45 million loss of income in our area. If we continue to outsource our jobs in our area, the 7,000 union workers in Marathon County will be without a job. What is your recommendation to change this and reverse this trend so there are jobs in this area?
If I could take a crack at that first, that's precisely the issue that I was trying to address in terms of changing the rules of international trade. That the paper industry in Wisconsin has been hit very hard, and in part because of the way we have structured our trading with other nations. And if we had fair rules that leveled the playing field in terms of at least basic wages being paid to workers, of having the right to organize in all of our trading partners, of having certain minimal environmental standards and adherence to human rights, that would go a long ways towards stopping the kind of plant closings that you're talking about. There are also questions, obviously, about Chinese currency manipulation, and as you are undoubtedly aware, there have been international trade cases that have been filed internationally, one of which was won by the Appleton Corporation with regard to both Germany and China dumping paper products into the United States at less than cost. And there's a similar appeal to reverse the decision that went against the Kimberly plant. And if that can be reversed, then maybe that can begin to, you know, change the situation in Kimberly, which is a also raises a lot of other issues, since you've got a profitable corporation that doesn't want to run the plant or sell it. And some people have difficulties understanding that.
Is there, yes, there's another question down front.
Yes, I've been puzzled by the people who don't have much money being so willing to support by their vote, with their votes, the people who are obviously capitalists. One group that I know a little about, I'm wondering if that is, how much of an issue that is, like the 700 Club, the old Pat Robertson and all the bringing in the religion and convincing people they're doing the right thing. It seems to mask what they're doing. I'm interested in what your reactions are to that.
Well, I would certainly agree with that. I think, however, there's another aspect to it which perhaps this election has at least begun to overcome. And that is that I think a lot of people have lost faith in government to do anything that's useful for them. And that has been, in part, a result that we have had both incompetent government and government which has not been directed towards providing the kinds of service and assistance to people who need it, and not taking care of the basic infrastructure of our country, whether it's roads, bridges, sewerage and water systems, funding for our schools, whatever it happens to be. Both our social and physical infrastructure has been allowed to decay, and that's part of what needs to be dealt with in terms of the stimulus package as well. We need to begin investing in this country and its people again. But I think there has been, again, as a result of the neglect of those aspects of our society, there's been a tremendous drop in people's faith that government can do anything for them. And therefore, other issues, whether it's abortion or some religious aspect or guns, whatever, that those become the issues. People think, well, it's not my job that's at stake, it's my right to have a gun. And they're convinced that that's the only stake that they have in the political process.
I'd like to just say on the question of religion, let's not accept the idea that religion and politics means the 700 Club. And I think that there was a very deliberate and very determined effort on the part of the right and the corporate interests of this country to redirect the religious sentiment in this country away from notions of economic justice, away from explicit talk of social justice and economic democracy, and to undermine any religious direction that supported working people. There was a real campaign in the beginning in the 60s, but going through the 70s, accelerating in the 1980s, to simply change the subject of public morality. Whereas we used to talk about economic democracy and economic justice, and let's not forget that Dr. King was in Memphis to support a garbage strike. You have ministers and a religious community, in the Jewish community, in the Christian communities, in the Catholic social justice doctrines, that were all pro-worker in the 40s, 50s, 60s because of the outrages of the capitalist system that called upon the justice and the sentiments of the moral sentiments of these communities. And that was derailed in a conscious, deliberate attempt within the religious communities to change the subject and to bring forth a religious understanding that is just who do you sleep with, or more broadly, individual salvation and one's individual relationship with Christ in the Christian communities. And so I think that the task of reconstructing a progressive politics in this country has got to include within the religious communities a deliberate attempt to recapture the moral high ground for working class interests. And that, I think, we're still in the middle of trying to just get started, and we'll see how that all unfolds. But certainly anybody here who's involved in their religious communities has a role to play within those communities to bring that question to the fore.
We have arrived at the magic hour, and I want to invite all of you to step around the corner for a little reception, just to your right as you go out the door at the end of the hall, the terrace room. And I want to thank our presenters for a most stimulating evening.